Earlier this week, the UK-based Standard Chartered Bank admitted to being involved in collusion with its competitors to manipulate the rand-dollar exchange rate. But this admission, while coming as a shock to many South Africans, is just one part of a much larger picture. And today, in this video, we are going to look at the whole thing. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of what exactly has happened with this currency manipulation case, we need to first understand a little bit of basic economics. The main concept that we're going to be dealing with in this case is the idea of collusion. Collusion in economic terms refers to when entities or individuals will work together to influence the market pricing for their own advantage. Typically with collusion, competitors within the same industry, instead of actually competing against each other, will rather work together to ensure that prices remain high and that they can maximize their profits as much as possible. Thus, by its very nature, collusion is anti-competitive. Now, collusion and competitors working together to shift pricing away from the market competitive price is generally not very good for consumers. This sort of collusion and price fixing can lead to consumers paying higher on average prices than they would have in an otherwise competitive market. However, in this South African currency manipulation case, this wasn't just competitors coming together to fix the prices of goods and services. Instead, they were changing the actual value of the South African rand by manipulating the exchange rate. Now, a very brief rundown, the exchange rate is simply the cost of one currency in terms of another. So when looking at the rand-US dollar pairing, the exchange rate essentially refers to how many rands you would have to spend in order to purchase one US dollar. Typically, a country's exchange rate is affected by a huge variety of different factors. Governments can and sometimes do intervene to try and push the exchange rate in a favorable direction. However, what was happening in this case is instead of allowing the exchange rate to be determined by a combination of market factors and the government, private banks were communicating with each other and deliberately trying to keep the exchange rate within certain ranges. The activities of these banks likely caused an undervaluing of the South African rand, meaning that one would have needed more South African rands to purchase one US dollar than in an otherwise perfectly competitive market. And a country's exchange rate is a very, very important part of their entire economic ecosystem. And it can influence a huge number of things. Most directly, it would affect imports and exports into a country, but it would also have an impact on things like foreign direct investment. And the exchange rate can also affect things like inflation, especially in economies where a large proportion of their goods are imported from other countries. A fluctuating or weak exchange rate can result in higher levels of inflation in that country as goods become more expensive for consumers within the country. The exchange rate can also have an effect on interest rates within the country, as when currency depreciates and this causes high inflations, the Reserve Bank of a country, or in this case the South African Reserve Bank, can try and correct that by increasing interest rates in order to combat the inflation. So now that we understand the economic basics of the situation, what actually happened in South Africa and how did these banks come together to manipulate the South African rand? Because collusion and price fixing can be so harmful to consumers, in many countries, including South Africa, there are laws and regulations prohibiting this sort of collusion. In South Africa, the Competition Commission was established to promote and maintain competition. The commission is responsible for helping to enforce the Competition Act and is empowered to control, investigate, and evaluate restrictive business practices within South Africa. Essentially, the Competition Commission is responsible for making sure that illegal monopolies do not emerge and that illegal collusion does not occur in the South African economy. 28 banks have been accused of and investigated for manipulating the rand-US dollar exchange rate between 2003 and 2013. These banks include a mixture of both local South African banks and international banks. Although the alleged currency manipulation dates back to 2003, the Competition Commission in South Africa only began investigating the issue in 2015. Following a 2-year investigation into the allegations, the Competition Commission then referred the matter to the Competition Tribunal for prosecution. In 2017, only 17 banks had been implicated so far, and these included the Bank of America Merrill Lynch International, BNP Paribas, JP Morgan Chase & Co., JP Morgan Chase Bank, Investec, Standard New York Securities, HSBC Bank, Standard Chartered Bank, Credit Suisse Group, Standard Bank of South Africa, Commerzbank AG, Australia New Zealand Banking Group, Nomura International, Macquarie Bank, Absa Bank Limited, Barclays Capital, and Barclays Bank. The banks involved were accused of using instant messaging platforms in order to communicate with each other and coordinate their trading activities when giving quotes to customers to buy and sell currencies. The banks were able to buy and sell US dollars in exchange for the rand at fixed prices by generating fake sales in order to drive up demand, as well as agreeing not to trade during certain specific time periods. The Commission's investigation between 2015 and 2017 had found significant evidence implicating these banks, and ultimately ended up bringing 28 banks under investigation, including both Nedbank and FirstRand, in addition to the banks already listed. However, all 28 banks implicated in the findings by the Competition Commission lodged some sort of application or objection. These various applications and objections brought by the banks have vastly delayed the work of the Competition Tribunal in actually settling these cases. Ultimately, only one of the implicated banks settled their case in 2017. This was Citibank NA South Africa. After cooperating with the Commission, Citibank was given a fine of 69.5 million rand. This equates to less than 10% of its annual turnover. Meanwhile, the cases against the other banks were delayed while the tribunal had to deal with the applications and objections that were brought by various banks. However, eventually, many years later, on the 30th of March 2023, the Competition Tribunal was finally able to dismiss a various number of applications and objections brought by 15 different banks. The tribunal also had to dismiss a second round of applications brought against it by some of the banks, and it also had to rule that it did in fact have the jurisdiction to hear the cases. The most recent development in these cases is now the settlement with Standard Chartered Bank. This week, Standard Chartered Bank admitted to the Competition Tribunal that it was involved in the currency manipulation it was accused of. The bank admitted its liability and has agreed to settle for an amount of 42.5 million South African rand. Additionally, Standard Chartered Bank has agreed to provide the Competition Tribunal with instant messaging transcripts of conversations that took place between its employees and those of its competitors. Although Standard Chartered has admitted its responsibility and settled its case, many other banks are still fighting the case, with many of them currently appearing before the Competition Appeal Court, seeking to set aside the order from the 30th of March 2023 that said that the cases against them should proceed. So, 2 banks have settled their cases, and the Competition Tribunal is dealing with the others. However, many in South Africa are now learning about these cases for the first time and are questioning if these settlements are really adequate for the crimes that were committed. The currency manipulation that these banks took part in is likely to have had profound effects on the South African economy. And South African citizens and consumers have no doubt felt these effects in their daily lives. But the fines that these banks are receiving from the Competition Tribunal seem insignificant, especially when compared to the turnover and the revenue that they generate on an almost daily basis. South Africa's ruling party, the ANC, has stated that they do not believe that a 43 million rand fine is sufficient for the harm that was caused to the economy by these currency manipulations. And while they commended the Competition Commission for their investigations, they want the banks involved to face criminal charges. This is a sentiment that many South Africans seem to echo, pointing out how insignificant the fines are and questioning how this can make up for the damage that was done. At this stage, though, it is not certain whether any further charges will be brought against these banks or the individuals within them who colluded in this manner.